Even though it's the end of June, I feel it's like the first day of school. I'm so excited to be back, and more so excited to see everyone. I've been seeing quite a few of you on the Zoom talks, but this is better. This is better, especially better for me, because then I can get some reaction from people as I talk. And so welcome and thank you again. And everybody's looking great. A few people coming in here. So my name is John Gardella. I think just about everybody has been here before, seen me talk. But if you haven't, I'm a retired high school teacher. I taught AP History plus AP United States Government and Politics, hence the four-part series on the institutions of government. We're on the third part, which is the executive branch. And so we'll take it, which is a big topic, of course, but I've tried to break it down for some interesting points of view. As always, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'll do my best to answer you if I know the answer. And if I don't, I'll certainly tell you. So the institutions of government, executive branch. Oh, by the way, I think most people have noticed, a number of people have commented, there's no cookie table over here. Yeah, she's not allowed. We were told we were not allowed to bring any treats.
When will she be allowed?
Well, I don't know. I should have had that in my contract or in her contract. Yeah, I'm not sure. But on the Zoom call, a few times I said, let's make some cookies. I'm just going to take a bite of a cookie during my Zoom call. But I figured I'd sit here, click, 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 and everybody would be gone. So,
Don't you worry, he's had his cookies.
yeah. I've had my cookies. I haven't starved. So anyway, so the institutions of government. So the agenda, as you know, we always have an essential question. And today the essential question is, how powerful is the president? Does the office have too much or too little power to effectively lead the nation in the 21st century? So I just want you to think about that as we go through the talk. We're going to talk about presidents versus prime ministers, the evolution of the presidency, and we'll look at some powerful and some weak presidents, powers of the president, the office of the president, presidential character, the president's program, presidential transition, and then the discussion on how powerful the president is. So let's just first of all look at prime ministers and presidents. How many of you have watched on BBC or C-SPAN the Parliament? And so a few people have. It's a great thing to watch, to see the prime ministers go in front of Parliament, because they're members of Parliament, and have to defend their administration. And it's great entertainment, for one thing. There's cheering and booing and pounding on the benches, especially the backbenchers. Much different than ours, though. We've had some State of the Unions that have been a little rowdy. So the president, of course, is popular. Primary vote is how he gets into the general election. And then in the general election, it's an indirect election, as we know. When we go to the polls, what we're really doing is electing or choosing which set of electors are going to vote for president. And we'll talk about the Electoral College a little bit more in a bit. The president is not and cannot be a member of Congress. Of course, he's the chief executive of the government. The presidents are often outsiders, meaning they're not senators or members of the House. Quite often they're governors, even sometimes just a real estate guy, or developer. And their cabinets quite often are also not insiders or members of government. So that's going to be a real difference. And there's no guarantee of a majority in the legislature, in the House and the Senate, for a president. Quite often it's called divided government. But even as we're seeing today, with a unified government, Democrats controlling the presidency, the House, and the Senate, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to accomplish all they want to accomplish. Prime ministers, they're chosen by and responsible to their party. Okay, so that's a big difference. Where presidents can run independent of the party, they're always members of a party. But for instance, President Trump was not the Republican Party's first choice, for sure, when he ran the first time. They are a member of Parliament. They're always members of Parliament. They are the chief executive. They choose their cabinet ministers, who are almost always MPs. Like, very rarely they'll choose somebody that's not an MP, MP meaning member of Parliament. They remain in office as long as the party holds the majority. If their political party, the Labor Party or whatever, loses, or Conservative Party loses the majority, then they're automatically out of office. They also quite often have to call for a new election if they lose a vote in Parliament, lose a vote to their own party. We saw that in Brexit, the several year-long problems with Brexit caused lots of problems. And the prime ministers always have a majority in Parliament until they don't. Okay, and then they're out. Okay, evolution of the presidency. So we're going back to the Founding Fathers. In the Constitutional Convention in 1787, they feared anarchy and monarchy in equal measures. Okay, and we had looked when we did the U.S. history, how Shays' Rebellion, for instance, really shook up the Founding Fathers and actually drove them to calling for a constitutional convention. Defining the chief executive's office was hotly debated with many different options put forth. They talked about committees. Some talked about a constitutional monarchy, all sorts of different things. But almost no one paid attention to James Wilson of North Carolina when he suggested a single elected president. That wasn't even hardly discussed until they really started to examine what they needed. And eventually they decided that in a large nation, even just 13 colonies was still a very large nation, they were going to need a president with significant powers. We were a fledgling country, right? We had won the war of independence, but France was much more powerful. Great Britain was much more powerful. We had to worry about Spain. So those were important issues that they were considering. Now, just about everybody, agreed that George Washington was going to be the first president. And in fact, he ran unopposed twice. Concerns of the office expressed in 1787 included the power of commander-in-chief, being in charge of the armed forces, even though the armed forces were very tiny at the beginning of our country. It was feared that the president could take over the states and the state governments using the state's own militia. The way the militias operate, we call them today National Guard, right? And the National Guard is controlled by the governor of each state until the president nationalizes the National Guard. And that's how National Guardsmen end up in places like Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam or whatever. Another concern was that the Senate would make presidents the tool of the Senate. In other words, they would control the president because of the shared power of of approving officials and ratifying treaties. The biggest concern, though, was over re-election. The founders feared that human nature would often prevent a president from giving up the power of the office. And in fact, I think I've mentioned this before in my talks, when King George III heard that George Washington was not going to run for a third term, he said if he really gives up his power, he's the greatest man in history. And coming from King George III. Interestingly enough, though, in the original Constitution, of course, there was no limit to, there were 4-year terms, but no limit to the 4-year terms. Governor Morris of Pennsylvania said, make him too weak, the legislature will usurp his powers. Make him too strong, he will usurp the legislature. And it's interesting looking at these comments from the 21st century point of view, and we can talk about that in a bit. Okay, the Electoral College, and I know most people don't like the Electoral College. I'm one of them. But let's look at why they decided on the Electoral College. After much discussion, it was decided that the president should be elected by voters, but of course, which voters? The new nation was large and diverse, and it seemed unlikely that every voter would have information to cast an informed vote or would be open to corruption by their employer. Now, in 1787, there was a very high percentage of land ownership by the citizens of the new United States. Many people were farmers and owned their own land. Each state was able to determine, though, who would be eligible to vote or not. They also feared that the direct popular vote would give too much power to the large populous states. They decided that a smaller, informed group would make a better decision. Okay, so they were concerned about that. Now, the Electoral College. Each state would choose a slate of electors in any manner they chose. Those electors would then meet in each state capital and vote for the president and vice president. Okay? So it was expected that many states would choose favorite sons. And if you remember the old conventions that we watched on television that were truly competitive conventions, people quite often in the first round would vote for a favorite son. Usually someone, well, it was always someone important from their state, but who was not going to have a chance to be elected. Preventing a majority winner, so the election would fall to the House of Representatives, where each state gets one vote if it falls to the House. Okay, it's happened twice in our history, in 1800 and 1824. Should have happened in 1876, but they ignored the Constitution and just worked out a deal. So anyway, that was, and it was expected by the Founding Fathers that quite often the election would fall to the House of Representatives. Now, the plan seemed to meet every test because the big states would have their say, and smaller states would have a minimum of 3 electors. Remember, each state has 2 senators, and each state has a minimum of 1 member of the House. The House, of course, is based on the population of the state in proportion, with 435 total House members split over the 50 states. So that would give some protection to the small states. Now, the founders did not foresee the rise of national political parties providing nationwide support for a slate of national candidates. They just didn't see it. A constitutional amendment, for those of you who don't like the Electoral College, is pretty hard. And on the Electoral College, it would be, I don't know how it would occur, frankly, and politically. But it requires, as does any amendment, 2/3 of both houses of Congress have to propose, or 2/3 of the states in constitutional convention have to propose. That's the proposal, 2/3. And then 3/4 of the states have to ratify, to accept the amendment to have it actually change the Constitution. Very difficult to do. If you think about it, is the House of Representatives going to be eager to give up that potential power to choose the president? Are the small states going to, give up that minimum of 3 electoral votes? So pretty hard to achieve. Article 2 of the United States Constitution, which of course covers the executive. Some of this I've copied directly from the Constitution. Some of it I've paraphrased a little bit, depending on how awkward the wording was. So the executive power shall be invested in a president. He, and I put in bold, that's my bold, okay, but it's not my feeling. But anyways, that's what they said. Of course, they never expected in 1787 to have a woman be president. And of course, we haven't had one. Shall hold office for a term of 4 years. President Washington set a precedent for 2 4-year terms. The 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951, established a 2-term limit. It was after FDR being elected to the presidency 4 times. The Republicans said, no, we've got to put a stop to that. Can't have that happen again. The requirements for president: you have to be a natural-born citizen, in other words, a birthright citizen of the United States. You can't be naturalized. Okay, 35 years of age and 14 years residing in the United States. Powers of the president: commander-in-chief of the military and the state militias when called into service, is the most powerful, the strongest power, I guess I'm trying to say, of the president. He really has a ton of power over military decisions. He can require reports from the heads of departments regarding their duties and responsibilities, power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the U.S. except for impeachment, power with advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties as long as 2/3 of the Senate concur, power to nominate and appoint with the advice and consent of the Senate ambassadors or other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other offices of the United States whose appointments are not herein provided for. Power to fill all vacancies that may happen when the Senate is in recess, and we've seen that happen fairly, in our recent history. If positions are not being filled or approved by the Senate, when they go out of session, the president will appoint somebody. In theory, that person has to leave office when the Senate comes back at the end of the next Senate session. Okay, relationships with Congress. Of course, the president signs off on all laws before they can become a law, unless, of course, there's an override by a 2/3 vote. He shall, and this is directly from the Constitution, from time to time give the Congress information on the state of the Union and recommend measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. He may call Congress into session on extraordinary occasions. So if they're not in session, he can say, come back into session. He shall take care that laws be faithfully executed, which is called wielding the executive power, and shall commission all officers of the United States. Okay, so those are basically his powers. Much more powerful internationally on international issues than a president is on domestic issues. The first presidents. So the first presidents were all prominent men active in the movement for independence or the founding, or both, and/or founding. And the first 5 presidents, of the first 5 presidents, only John Adams didn't serve 2 terms. Washington and Monroe were not even opposed. When Monroe ran for president in 1816, there was actually only one political party. The Federalists had fallen away. It was known as the era of good feelings because everybody agreed, which was not true at all. So Monroe was unopposed. Congress in Washington had to build the new government based on the framework provided by the Constitution. So when you read the Constitution and you think about that, it's a framework. Everything had to be put in place and actually made to be. So that's one of Washington's real greatnesses. Certainly. There were 2 leading spokesmen for the major viewpoints that were in his cabinet. Of course, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, and if my 12-year-old granddaughter was here right now, she'd go into the entire Hamilton musical. She can sing the whole thing and dance along with it as well, which is pretty neat. Hamilton favored urban commercial interests and Great Britain. Okay? Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson favored rural, small-town farming views and France. And of course, France and England didn't like each other at all. So that was a big thing. So what happens here is the Hamiltonians, okay, become the Federalist Party, and the Jeffersonians become the Democratic Republican Party. And they were really in opposition. Washington spoke strongly against factions, as they were referred to, political parties, in his farewell address. Everybody knows the farewell address, for staying out of the political affairs or the affairs of Europe. But he also said, factions are no good. They're not going to do us any good. And if you remember, Madison had written about factions in Federalist 10, the essay on why the government should be, the Constitution should be ratified. And he said that in a big republic like the United States, there'd be so many factions that the competition between them would cause compromise. So they wouldn't be a problem. So we know what's going on today. So establishing legitimacy for the presidency was made easier because the national government really had very little to do. It was small, and it didn't do that much for the first, really up until the Civil War. The Treasury Department under Hamilton established a sound currency and paid the debts of the war, which was really important. And while Jefferson had the difficult task of handling Great Britain and France. Okay, powerful presidents. So we think in a modern era of presidents that they're all powerful, that they're these really powerful positions. But in the past, not all showed the instinct or ability to be an effective leader for the nation. We're going to look at a few. You'll have heard of all these people. But in this next section, what I'd like to do is point out how each one brought about change to the country, and that's, in my opinion, why they were good leaders, whether you agree with the change or not. But at least they brought about change and moved the country forward. Okay, so Andrew Jackson, the top left, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, who's fallen out of favor recently, but I'll talk about that briefly, and of course Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. So Andrew Jackson. Now, broad changes were going on in American politics at the time of his presidency. He, of course, was a war hero. He had been a judge. He had been in Congress. He was fiery. He fought, knife fights against his opponents. I mean, he was really, really quite a character. And in 1824, he ran for president, and he believed that there was a corrupt bargain that cost him the presidency. Okay? He won the most popular votes. John Quincy Adams came in second, but he didn't win a 51% of the Electoral College votes. Okay? Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, okay, was third. And of course, the vote went to the House of Representatives. Adams named Clay to be his next Secretary of State. All the previous presidents, except for, of course, Washington, had been Secretary of State. That was like a stepping stone up to the presidency. And so the presidency went to John Quincy Adams. Well, Jackson just went out of his mind, and he went out and started his own political party called the Democratic Party. Okay? It was a party of the people. Now, why does it matter that it was a party of the people? Well, democracy was expanding quite a bit in the 1820s. The economy was changing. Not everybody were still in agriculture, still farmers. There were more tradesmen, more skilled craftsmen who didn't necessarily own much land, but they were important people and had money. So they were pushing in their state legislatures to allow them to vote. And so male suffrage, and we mean male suffrage, of course, really had expanded, and Jackson played right into that with his campaign. He campaigns for 4 years against John Quincy Adams, and of course wins in 1828. Now he, just as an aggressive personality that he was, he's going to change the presidency. He's really the first real powerful president, meaning not allowing Congress just to kind of run everything and having the president put in some suggestions or whatnot, but really not leading the political agenda of the country. Well, Jackson isn't like that. He vetoes 12 acts of Congress, more than all of his predecessors combined, and ignored several Supreme Court rulings, especially on the removal of the Cherokees from Georgia, which the Supreme Court specifically told him 3 times he couldn't do, and they got moved. Jackson viewed himself as the tribune of the people, the man of the people. He didn't really have all that many new policies, but he struck down the ones he didn't like. Probably the most important was the National Bank, Hamilton's National Bank, that had to be re-upped every, I don't know how many years. And he couldn't legally destroy the bank, so he just went and ordered his Treasury Secretary to withdraw all the money. Okay, so the bank collapsed. Pretty effective way to do away with the bank. His fights with Congress led to powerful personalities and orators such as Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. This exacerbated or extended bitter rivalries that were developing over slavery and commercial policies, splitting the nation and the 2 major political parties. The Whig Party had they changed the name of the Democratic Republican Party to the Whig Party, which had been the opposition party in England against the Kings, right? And the Whigs said, Andrew Jackson is like a monarch, he's a king, and therefore we're going to call ourselves Whigs because we are in opposition to him. So that party split basically north-south, and the Democratic Party is going to split north-south as well. After Jackson, I forgot to say there was a bad financial panic in 1837 because of his destroying of the banks. After Jackson, Congress reemerged as the most powerful branch. And between Jackson, whose presidency ended in 1837, and Grover Cleveland, and I didn't want to take up half a slide to explain Grover Cleveland because he had 2 terms, but they weren't consecutive. So his last term ended in 1897. Only Lincoln, a wartime president, served 2 terms. Everybody else was single-term presidents, did not get reelected or chose not to run. Abraham Lincoln. We all know Abraham Lincoln. We've all studied him, read about him. You know his dates, 1861 to 1865, the first Republican president, of course credited with the emancipation of slaves and maintaining the Union. His election in 1860 sparked the southern states to secede, leading the Civil War in April 1861. South Carolina actually was the first to secede in December of 1860, just weeks after Lincoln's victory. He was way away from inauguration. As a wartime president, he, with minimal political and military experience, he had to learn on the job, okay, which he did do very effectively and became an effective president. As chief executive, he saw the bureaucracy and military grow tremendously. So the responsibility of the government expands tremendously during the Civil War, which makes sense. A big issue was funding the war. The war cost overall the Union $3.4 billion. His Treasury Secretary, along with Lincoln, was Treasury Secretary Solomon Chase, convinced Congress to issue government bonds, sell some federal lands, print money, and establish the first income tax. Okay? And I thought you'd all enjoy this. The first income tax was 3% on incomes $600 to $10,000, and then 5% on incomes over $10,000. You'd have to be a multi-billionaire to get that rate today, right? I'm supposed to be non-political here, I apologize. Okay, the income tax provided 21% of the federal government spending throughout the war, but it was ruled unconstitutional in 1894, and it wasn't until 1913 that the 16th Amendment was passed, creating the income tax. It was ruled unconstitutional because it was a direct tax on the people, which wasn't called for in the Constitution. Overall, the Union borrowed 2/3 of the cost of the war. Okay, so Lincoln in April 1861 called for an increase in the military. It was, right after the start of the war, and the attack on Fort Sumter, and he just called for troops, expanded the military without Congress okaying it. Of course, they came back into session and did okay it. He also suspended habeas corpus, which is, there's only a couple of guarantees of freedom in the Constitution, okay? Habeas corpus, which is the right to a trial before you can be convicted of a crime. It's also, basically, it's the right to due process. You have to be brought in, told of your charges, and given a chance to defend yourself. So he suspends habeas corpus in Baltimore because there were riots and editors, newspaper editors in Baltimore were inflaming the people. Congress comes back and actually extends it from Washington, D.C. to New York City, and also extended it into the Confederate States, though it didn't really have much of an impact there. Lincoln became increasingly involved in military decisions as the war progressed, and he's best known for replacing Union generals for non-performance until he came upon Ulysses S. Grant, of course, who went out and won the war. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln eloquently stated, "With malice for none, with charity for all," basically reaching out to the Confederate States that they would be welcomed back into the Union once the war was over. Unfortunately, Lincoln is assassinated, and Andrew Johnson comes in to the presidency, and the radical Republicans, I know that sounds so strange today, but the radical Republicans were vehemently against allowing the South to come in, absolutely not come in easily. So that doesn't come to fruition. But Lincoln is ranked either the first or second of all presidents by historians and scholars. Teddy Roosevelt, our 26th president, is a powerful leader who brought about vast change in the country. He was a former police commissioner in New York City. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That's how we ended up with the Philippines. That's another story. I think I told it once before in one of my talks on imperialism. He had been governor of New York and, of course, vice president under McKinley. And no, it's not McKinley. Not Garfield. Our third president to be executed. Where's Judy? I'm just drawing a blank.
Who was Kennedy?
No, it wasn't Kennedy. It was. It'll come to me in a minute. No. It'll come. Thank you for your suggestions. Does anybody have Judy on speed dial? But anyway. Anyway, he becomes president. Enormous energy. This guy has enormous energy. He's brought up, of course, in great wealth and has a tragic life. Sometime, if you haven't, read Mornings on Horseback by I think it's by Manchester. Is it by Manchester? No, not Manchester.
I read it. I forget who wrote it.
Yeah, I did too. I was thinking it was, but anyway, it's a wonderful book of his life until his presidency.
Yes. McCullough.
Did he write Mornings on Horseback? Yeah, maybe. I didn't think it was McCullough, but it probably is. Yes, thank you. McKinley, somebody said?
Yes, 1901.
Yes, McKinley. Thank you so much. Republican, conservative. Okay, so where are we? So he's prepared. Oh, he's bucking the Republican establishment. He fought for progressive policies. Okay, and here's a guy is very wealthy. Again, is a Republican supported by the wealth, the Republicans in New York and whatnot, and he's going to go after their monopolies. He's a trust buster. In 1902, the coal miners who lived horrendous lives, I mean, really horrendous lives, and child labor, and women down in it was awful, go on strike. It's a nationwide strike. It's paralyzing the industry. He calls the mine workers labor unions and the owners of the mines and sits them down at the White House and said, "I'm nationalizing the mines. You guys better work this out." Okay, and they did. He called for a square deal for the workers. In other words, you're not giving them enough to live on. You got to give them at least enough to live on. He also fought for food safety and established, of course, 5 new national parks, along with a bunch of other things. So he's a progressive. When he wanted to take over the building of the Panama Canal, France had started it under Ferdinand de Lesseps, and then the yellow fever had stopped that project. So it had fallen apart. So TR says we need that because we need a two-ocean navy if we're going to be a powerful nation. We have to be able to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific very quickly, so hence the Panama Canal. So he he used his workings and sent agents down, and Colombia basically was forced to give up the Isthmus of Panama to Panama. And when Colombia raised some troops, Teddy Roosevelt sent down a warship, which pretty much put a stop to that. And people criticized him, and he said, I took the canal zone and let Congress debate. And while the debate goes on, the canal does also. So he said, let them debate me, but we're building the canal. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating an end to the Russo-Japanese War and the Treaty of Portsmouth. And he was really the first to travel around the nation giving speeches everywhere using the bully pulpit as a platform for presidents to promote their programs. And of course, that is done all the time now. And the public loved him. Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, Democrat, made America an important player on the world stage. Okay, he had been the president of Princeton University. He was an academic. He was from North Carolina, and it's come out a lot. A lot of people hadn't realized about this. He was actually a racist, and we'll get to that in a minute. He introduced his New Freedom domestic agenda at the beginning of his first term as president, and that was something no other president had ever done. He actually came out and said, this is my domestic agenda. This is what I intend to do for the American people. That was actually a new thing. The agenda called for conservation of natural resources, banking reform, tariff reduction, and equal access to raw materials. He personally delivered the State of the Union address. It had always just been given as a letter to Congress, at least since John Adams. And unfortunately, Teddy Roosevelt had begun to desegregate the federal government, the workers in the federal government, and Wilson put an end to that and reintroduced segregation, completely segregated workforce in the federal government. Prior to the U.S. entrance into the Great War, World War I, Wilson worked hard to keep America out of the war. Finally forced to enter the war, Wilson effectively and rapidly, with the appointment of excellent department leaders, organized the nation into a wartime economy and making America the arsenal of democracy. Now, on January 18th, 1918, in the State of the Union address, Wilson delivers what became known as his 14 points speech, where he laid out America's post-war goals. These included national sovereignty. This is for the world, okay? National sovereignty based on self-determination, freedom of the seas, and a League of Nations. Germany agreed to the armistice in 1918, November 1918, partly due to the terms expressed in the 14 points. And if you've listened to some of my other lectures too, many nations actually, the people that were trying to rise up against tyrannies or oppression from other nations really took to heart and tried to send representatives to Versailles to try to get the leaders of Versailles to back their movements for independence and freedom. Okay, after the fighting ended, Wilson traveled to France as a great hero and took a leadership role, though he was largely unsuccessful. Great Britain and France and Italy basically blocked a lot of his efforts. And as you know, Germany was extremely harshly treated, as was Austria, Hungary, and it kind of led to, well, it did lead eventually to World War II. But they do pass, in the Treaty of Versailles, they passed the League of Nations. That's one thing they did accept. Unfortunately, Wilson returns home, and there's a Republican-led Senate, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of the great state of Massachusetts blocked the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, and the United States never joined the League of Nations. We didn't provide our international leadership in it. Wilson had had a stroke, and so he, halfway through his campaign to try to promote it, he was out of, and we'll talk about this more later, but for 7 months he was just out of the public eye, and it goes down. Of course, we end up with World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, another president that you all know pretty well, our 32nd, he dramatically changes the size and the role of the federal government. Taking office on March 4th, 1933, the Great Depression was in its height in 1933. He took decisive actions with his banking holiday, immediately put into effect, which stopped the run on banks. As an orator, he expanded on his 1932 campaign speech of "There's nothing to fear but fear itself" with his radio fireside chats, which some of you, I'm sure, heard in person, which would have been pretty neat to actually, I've of course heard tapes, but to actually experience them. Providing Americans with information and courage to face both the Great Depression and then the war. His New Deal programs brought direct federal aid to needy people. It's the first time in our history that had actually happened, direct aid to people. He created jobs through all the different job programs, Works Progress Administration, et cetera, for the unemployed. And then he put through systematic changes to the way our government was working to try to prevent further depressions. And of course, the size and the scope of the government grew tremendously in this whole process. Prior to World War II, FDR worked with the isolationist Congress. Congress was very isolationist, as was most of the country, frankly, to bring desperate military aid to Great Britain through his Lend-Lease program. And as president, he oversaw and led the expansion of the military and the government to be able to win the war, basically. And after the war, he unfortunately dies just before victory in Europe, which was May 8th. He dies in April of 1945. But his decisions, a lot of them in the New Deal program, really helped bring about prosperity in America in the 1950s. And also, of course, America comes out as a superpower, but not only militarily powerful, but also seen as a source of good, if you will, throughout the world, which I think President Biden was attempting to do this past week, to reassure people we're back and we're good people. The White House. Okay. Office of the President. So it was not until 1857 that presidents were allowed to have a secretary that was paid for by the government. Think about that, okay? It was not until 1901 that they had Secret Service protection after McKinley's assassination. And they were not able to submit a presidential budget until 1921. So you can see how it was really a small operation. Today, presidents have hundreds of staffers and advisors, it should be an S, making up a large bureaucracy. They no longer have to answer to the White House phone as President McKinley did. He used to actually answer, you call the White House, the president would answer, but can have trouble controlling such a large bureaucracy in the office of the president. See, and you hear about presidents all the time, Donald Trump especially, but Obama did as well, speaking about leaks and all these things going on, and they're always frustrated by this. The presidents not only live in the White House, but they work in the West Wing as well. Their closest staff, which do not have to be approved by the Senate and can be hired and fired at will, advise the president on policy and political matters. In 2001, President George W. Bush had 400 staffers and a budget of $35 million. I couldn't quickly find statistics for today, so that's what I went with. Essentially, there are three ways a president can organize their personal staff. By personal, I mean it's not people waiting on them, but helping them to organize their program in the White House. There's the pyramid structure, and most assistants report through a hierarchy to a chief of staff who deals directly with the president, used by most presidents, including Nixon, Reagan, Bush, Jeb Bartlett. You remember President Jeb Bartlett on the West Wing? West Wing show? Okay. If you haven't watched the West Wing, go out and, and you can get it on Netflix or whatever now. It's the best. But that was definitely a pyramid structure. The circular structure, which was used by Carter, basically where cabinet secretaries and assistants all reported directly to the president. So he was just like overwhelmed, people coming in and out of his office, and it was like an open office type of thing. And then the ad hoc structure, where task forces, committees, informal groups of advisors deal directly with the president, used by Clinton, FDR, I think Kennedy to a certain extent, and it appears that's what Trump was doing, basically having different groups that would advise him, and a lot of them were informal. FDR was famous for that, having friends around that would inform him and going back channels. So the executive office of the presidency is different than the office of the presidency, okay? So this is the EOP. Agencies in the executive office report directly to the president and perform services for him, but are not located in the White House. Their members may not enjoy intimate contact with the president. And we're not talking Clinton here. I shouldn't have said that. We're being filmed. I apologize. The cameraman said, I'll take care of that one. But in other words, close contact, coming in and going, speaking directly with the president. And some of the agencies are rather large bureaucracies, okay? The top positions are appointed by the president but must be confirmed by the Senate. So the Office of Management and Budget, which was established in 1921, is more than just creating a budget. It actually helps the president, in sort of an oversight way, control all the different bureaucracies. They do all sorts of things. We had a neighbor, a Concord boy, Dan Costello, who was very high up in the Office of Management and Budget under Clinton. And he, for instance, was in charge of the FBI budget. And we'd be talking to him, and he'd say, I've got a really tough meeting tomorrow. I've got to meet with the director of the FBI who wants to use the money that's allocated one place someplace else, and I have to approve it. And he's a scary guy, and I got to meet with him, So that's Office of Management and Budget, really one of the most important of these agencies. Director of National Intelligence, the Council of Economic Advisors, Office of Personnel Management, Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And of course, there's other agencies include Council on Environmental Quality, Domestic Policy Council, Gender Policy Council, National Economic Council, National Security Council, Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, Office of National Drug Control Policy, Office of Public Engagement, and Office of Science and Technology. This is taken directly off of the EOP website under President Biden. It could look different for different presidents, okay? All right. The cabinet. So the cabinet is a tradition, but largely a fiction, okay? Now, there are obviously department heads of department secretaries of all the different various governmental departments, But as far as meeting as a cabinet, sitting down in a large room around a table to hammer out the problems and fix the problems. What was that? Was the movie called Dave? When the guy ends up through some crazy situation, he ends up as president because he was a lookalike of the president. The president dies, they bring him in, and he's like an accountant. And he sits down with his cabinet and says, okay, we're going to work out all the problems in government. And they all throw out ideas and they solve everything. Doesn't work actually that way, unfortunately. And it wasn't even mentioned in the Constitution until the 25th Amendment, which actually deals with presidential succession, and naming the cabinet members in the order that they would become president if the president, vice president die, and the Speaker of the House and the president pro temp. If they all die, then it goes Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, and on down the line, depending on how they were created in the history of the government. In theory, it meets to discuss issues facing the nation and advises the president. Really, only Eisenhower kind of came close to having a deliberative body with the cabinet. Today, the vice president heads of 15 executive departments, including the attorney generals, make up the cabinet, and they'll do photo ops. The executive departments, all created by Congress, which pass many laws controlling the scope as well as the policies and procedures for each department. So, in addition, Congress controls the budget and has oversight over executive departments. So the idea that the president, is controlling all these executive departments with a firm hand is not accurate, okay? The power is really spread out, not to mention you have the bureaucrats within each department, and that's not a negative term. The bureaucrats are the people who are professional government workers. It's their career. But they also can be very protective of their job and what they're in charge of. They firmly believe in it, and it can be hard for a president to make changes, right? So the presidents only have so much power, and this is one of the reasons why domestically presidents are not that powerful. They can't just force change. The president also appoints the sub-cabinet officials, the undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries for each department. That's where the Trump administration was actually really lax or behind the eight ball, because they never appointed a lot of these positions, and they never got around to it. And so a lot of the government was not functioning very efficiently. Same thing happened in the foreign policy with the Department of State. Independent agencies and commissions. The president also appoints people to more than 4 dozen independent agencies and commissions that are not cabinet level, but by law often have quasi-independent status. Many heads have set terms of office and can only be removed for cause. I use the Postal Service as an example. It's controlled by a 9-member board of governors who are appointed by the president. 6 of the 9 members are currently appointed by President Trump, okay? And they serve I forget how many, I think 7-year term or something like that. So it's quite a long term. The Postmaster General is appointed by the board and serves a 6-year term, okay? And he may not be fired by the president, but can be removed by the board. So many of you, like we were, frustrated with the performance of the post office last year, trying to send presents and cards around the country because it had been reduced in size so much. There was really only so much limited that the new President Biden coming in can really do, because it's an independent agency. Other examples include Federal Reserve Board members. They serve for 14 years. Federal Trade Commission, 7 years. Consumer Safety Product Commission, 6 years. Federal Communications Commission, 7 years, and the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, 5 years. And so, I was thinking about these terms. Congress obviously put in longer than just a single presidential term, so they would be they wouldn't be as subject to the whims of a new president coming in. Okay, presidential character. What could we possibly talk about here? So every president brings in a distinctive personality, and the president's character says a lot about the organization of the White House, in other words, how he does business. And I apologize for keeping on saying he, but it's difficult to say he, she all the time, so I'm saying he because we haven't had a she. No, please don't take offense in that. It also has a critical impact on his interactions with the press and his popularity with the public. Okay? Eisenhower was an orderly, military-style guy. He was very formal. He was not a strong orator, but gave the perception of a strong leader. He famously said that the only time you really need a president is when there's a national emergency. He said most of the time the president should play golf, which he did a lot. But just sort of stay out of things and let Congress run the country and states run the country and not be too involved, unless there's an emergency. JFK projected an articulate, bold, and often amusing, he was an amusing leader who surrounded himself with talented amateurs. He was young with a young family. He was loved by the nation, or most of the nation. LBJ was a master legislative strategist who used his his powerful personality to convict people, and he was a famous close talker. He was known, I've seen photographs of this, he would get a congressman or a senator into the Oval Office and get him around the neck. So the guy's face, they were face to face, and LBJ was 6'4", right? So face to face, and be talking to him like this, and of course the guy's going to agree just to get his personal space back. Reagan, an outsider, called the great communicator, gave wide latitude to his subordinates and cabinet as long as they followed his ideological framework. That's how he and Nancy could get upstairs to watch television in the evening with their TV dinners, which they were famous for having. But again, he's such a good communicator, he was loved by a lot of the country, even if he didn't agree with his policies. Clinton was also an outsider, an excellent orator who could make almost anything sound plausible. Okay. And he paid close attention to details when developing his policies. Dan, the guy who was high up in the OMB, said, you talk to Clinton and he'd be like, he knew everything. And, he was very, very involved. George W. Bush ran as an outsider, wanting to focus on domestic issues. He was deeply religious. Bush often talked about his faith, which resonated with many voters. He, along with Vice President Cheney, ran a tightly controlled White House. The attacks on September 11th forced Bush to leave his domestic policy. Bush came into office completely focused on domestic policy. And of course, he's forced to talk about international affairs, which he wasn't very experienced at. It was not a strength. He got an initial bump in popularity for his handling and his demeanor, if you will, after 9/11, but questions arose about his honesty and intelligence and his decision to broaden the war on terrorism in Iraq. And of course, went way downhill from there. Since then, he's looked a lot better, hasn't he, as we see him speak. But the impact of personality on Obama, Trump, and Biden, we could talk about that if you'd like in our discussion at the end. How'd you like I played around that one? Huh? Mrs. Keneally, huh? Pretty good. Okay, power to persuade. And very important power. The presidents are not given great powers by the Constitution. As I said, they're much more powerful abroad than they are at home. The Constitution did provide presidents and vice presidents with being the only nationally elected office. Okay, so they are at all sorts of ceremonies, important events in our nation, and they can use that as a platform and be a spokesperson representing the nation home and abroad, which gives them quite a bit of power. So as a result, the power to persuade, convince people, though an official is one of the president's most important and effective powers. And he basically aims it at three distinct audiences. The first is the Washington, D.C. audience of fellow politicians and government leaders. A president's reputation is of great importance as to how much deference the president will receive from these power brokers in Washington. If he is thought to be effective, then he will be effective, okay? An example, FDR had great gravitas throughout the government, so he was able to get a lot done. Jimmy Carter did not in his single term, just as an example. And you can think of other presidents and make your decision on that. The second group or audience of the presidential power of persuasion are party activists, office holders outside of Washington, think partisan grassroots groups. This group wants the president to exemplify their principles, trumpet their slogans, appeal to their hopes and fears, and help them get reelected. As politics become more ideological, fire and brimstone speeches confirm their shared sense of purpose and help them to raise money. Okay, so you think about our last president, right? Very effective of going around the country with this fire and brimstone. We didn't really think of it that way, but these, big, huge stadiums, big speeches, saying the same thing over and over again, and his base loved it and still do. The public is the third audience. When campaigning, a presidential hopeful speaks boldly of what he will accomplish, but once in office, talks about the challenges of accomplishing things. So when he's running, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and we're going to make everything great. And once he becomes president, they're like, well, this is kind of tough, and we've got some challenges we have to overcome. A president soon learns also that every utterance is scrutinized by the media and by organized groups at home and abroad. Errors in fact, judgment, timing, or even inflection, the way he speaks, will immediately be pointed out by the media. As a result, most presidents try to stick to formal speeches using the prestige of office as a bully pulpit. And of course, President Trump did not do that, and I think it really impacted him. And if you've read people that work for President Trump as advisors, they were constantly trying to get him to stick to the speech, and he almost never did, and opened himself to a lot of criticism. Power to say no. The Constitution gives the president the power to veto legislation, which we know. He can veto legislation in two ways. One, a veto measure. I think I covered this when we talked about Congress, but I'll put it in again quickly. The president will send a message within 10 days of receiving a proposed bill or proposed law explaining why he is rejecting it. Congress then can either rewrite the bill so the president will accept it, or pass an override, which is a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate to override the president, and then the bill becomes law without the president's signature. He also may pocket veto a bill. The president doesn't sign a bill within 10 days, and Congress has adjourned within that time, then the bill does not become law. So if you think back throughout our congressional histories, right at the end of congressional terms, remember, last for 2 years, right? So right at the end of a congressional term, they pass a bunch of stuff so they can go home and say to their constituents, see what we passed. And it's easy for the president right at the end of the term just to pocket veto. He just doesn't do anything. It doesn't become law. Executive privilege. Okay, we heard about that a lot in the last year and also in our past modern history. The Constitution says nothing about whether a president can refuse to divulge private communications between himself and advisors, typically to Congress, but sometimes to the courts. Presidents have acted as though they do have the right based on their argument on 2 grounds. The first being the doctrine of separation of powers means one branch cannot interfere with the inner workings of another branch. Another is the principles of statecraft and prudent administration require a president to be able to have discussions about what if we do this, what if we do that, without having it being leaked into the Congress or into the press. Of course, that's really important sometimes in foreign policy. The Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Nixon, 1973, there is no absolute unqualified presidential privilege of immunity from judicial process under all circumstances. In other words, Nixon had to give up the tapes. And then in Clinton v. Jones, 1997, that was extended to a limit on immunity to civil court cases. Now, we know that George W. Bush and Donald Trump greatly expanded executive privilege, basically in situations where they were not even in the room or involved in the discussions, but just people within their administration were talking about things and claimed executive privilege. President Trump, of course, in his impeachment trials, basically claimed that to prevent people that were advising him from testifying before Congress. And Congress, I think it was a mistake. The House of Representatives did not go to the Supreme Court. Of course, there was a time issue because they thought they were going to run out of time before the court would rule. So there was no definitive question on that. And then the last one is impoundment of funds. That's basically the president refuses to spend money that Congress has allocated, okay? And it can be done for all sorts of reasons. One, they think it's a waste of money, or politically they don't like the idea or something. So in response, Congress passed the Budget Reform Act of 1974, which included a provision that a president must spend all the money appropriated by Congress unless he informs Congress and they agree within 45 days. So he can refuse, but he's got to send a letter to Congress, I'm refusing for these reasons, and they have to say, okay, you don't have to spend the money. Okay. President's program. President's campaign, sometimes for several years, giving nearly identical stump speeches where they outline their goals in very simple terms. We know this, you know. Some presidents run for 4 years. President Romney. Senator Romney ran for like 7 years for president and giving the same speech. Once elected and inaugurated, they have this tremendous amount of things they have to do. Appoint a cabinet, other officials, prepare the State of the Union, develop a budget. So they've got a lot on their plate. To develop a program and new policies, the president relies on several sources, each with particular strengths and weaknesses. Special interest groups, okay? They provide, and these were lobbyists and things like that, they provide a lot of information, but of course it's one point of view. A lot of times it usually is politically motivated. So that could be a weakness, though they are knowledgeable. Aides and campaign advisors will tend to try to only have him develop things that he promised in his speech and not take into account other points of view. Federal bureaus and agencies, and I'd mentioned the bureaucracies, not wanting to give up their own power or at all limit themselves. So they, again, have a limited point of view. And other academics and specialists and experts, which quite often have a lot of knowledge, but may not know the workings of government as well, and the politics as well. So they take in all this information. There's two approaches for a president to develop a program. One is like Clinton and Carter. They had a policy on absolutely everything. Senator Warren, in her campaign, had a policy on everything, right? And she was very proud of that. She goes, I'm a policy wonk. In other words, I'm very, very concerned about policy. That requires endless hours to learn about and then state their positions on many issues. The other method is illustrated by Reagan, is to concentrate on 3 or 4 major initiatives and leave everything else to subordinates. So in other words, I want to cut taxes, I want to strengthen the military, and I want to fight communism. Okay? Those were his major initiatives. And I don't care how you do it, just get it done. I'm going upstairs to have dinner with Nancy. A president must then judge the mood of the nation regarding the policies and then sell it to the politicians and citizens alike. Major constraints. One is this time and attention. So many things are coming at a president, and they really don't have that much time. Remember the famous 100 days, right? Trying to get as much done as they supposedly have this leeway from criticism. The federal government, federal programs, the federal budget can only be changed so much, except in special circumstances. The discretionary budget, right, is really very small compared to what items in the budget that have to be spent, like Medicare and Social Security and paying off the debts, that sort of thing. An unexpected crisis, and of course this is huge. Johnson had the Vietnam War, though it wasn't totally unexpected. Nixon, Watergate, Reagan, Iran-Contra crisis. George W. Bush, 9/11, Obama, the Great Recession, of course, Trump, COVID-19 pandemic. Those were all things that really impacted their trying to pass their programs. Presidential transition. We're almost there to our discussion, so you've been great. March 4th, 1801 was a great day for American democracy. Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as the nation's 3rd president, bringing about a peaceful transition of power from the defeated Federalist President John Adams. So we had a one-term president, John Adams, of the Federalist Party. He loses, right? But gives up power. Now, these two men who had been great friends really had a tough campaign. There's all sorts of course, they weren't out campaigning personally, but in their representatives used all sorts of slurs and lies and everything against the opposition. But Jefferson gets up on March 4th, 1801, and says, "We are all Democratic Republicans, we are all Federalists, we are all Americans." Okay? You heard that referred to a lot around January 20th of this year. That's always been an important aspect of our democracy. Since Washington, only FDR served more than 2 terms in office, and as I'd mentioned earlier, the 22nd Amendment ensured that no president would do so again. Only about 1/3 of presidents since George Washington have been elected to a 2nd term. Of the 28 not reelected, 4 died during their 1st term, and the presidents who were reelected to a 2nd term fall into a certain historic period, certain type of historic period. The Founding Fathers, except for John Adams. During wartime, don't change horses in the middle of the stream, right? Or they were in office during tranquil times. In other words, everything was great. Eisenhower, okay, is a good example of that. when the nation was deeply divided, it was rare for a president to be elected to a second term, such as before the Civil War and during Reconstruction. So during those times, and as I said, only Lincoln was actually, for a good part of that, and it was a long period of time, was elected twice. 8 vice presidents have become president due to the death of their predecessor, but only 4 vice presidents were later able to be elected to office on their own. Problems of succession. If a president dies in office, it is clear that the vice president becomes president. Nobody questions that. But what if the president becomes seriously ill or otherwise incapacitated but does not die? It's happened twice. James Garfield was shot on July 2nd, 1881, and lingered until September 19th, 1881. He was shot by an office seeker who was mad because he didn't get a job, shot him in the side and the back. Modern doctors said if they'd just put a Band-Aid on him, he would have been good to go. But they kept on trying to remove the bullet, and it became infected, and he died of infection. Woodrow Wilson, as I'd mentioned, had suffered a stroke, lingered in recovery out of public life for 7 months in 1919. He had just remarried, and his new wife was basically, kept him in his bedroom in the White House, and nobody spoke about anything. And can you imagine today, president disappears for 7 months, and everybody's like, well, what's going on here? Then, of course, President Kennedy, there was always the what if he hadn't died, but he was so badly incapacitated, what would have happened? So they passed the 25th Amendment. The other issue is, what if the vice president steps up and becomes president? Who then becomes vice president? So we'll just look at this quickly. It's ratified in 1967. So the disability question. If the president is unable to carry out his duties, then the vice president can serve as an acting president whenever the president declares he's unfit to serve. There was one of the shows on West Wing actually dealt with this issue. So if the president comes forward and says, I can't do it, then the vice president takes over until the president returns and says, okay, I'm good to go. But what if the president doesn't want to go, okay? And as you know, there was talk about this in the Trump administration, especially after January 6th, even though it was such a short period of time, were the cabinet officials and the vice president going to remove him from office? Well, what it takes is the vice president and the majority of cabinet officials have to agree that the president is unfit to serve. And then it goes, then they send a letter to Congress and the president informing them that he's going to be set aside. He's still president, but he doesn't have power. If the president disagrees, then 2/3 of both houses have to agree with the cabinet and the vice president that he's unable to serve. Very difficult circumstances, I think, if any president was challenging it. What if, as I said, you don't have a vice president? What happens? So the vice president is a question. In 1973, you remember Spiro Agnew? Okay, so Spiro Agnew resigned over pleading no contest to criminal charges. It had to do when he was governor, I think, of Ohio. I think it was Ohio. Maryland, thank you. Thank you. I love you guys. You're so smart. Okay. So President Nixon nominated Gerald Ford, okay, who was a congressional leader, very powerful guy in his own right. And they held hearings. He's confirmed by both houses of Congress, becomes vice president. Well, then Nixon, of course, resigns in 1974 after Watergate. Ford becomes president, and he nominated Nelson Rockefeller, who was confirmed by Congress. If you remember those hearings, I love those hearings, listening to Nelson Rockefeller. I remember him saying, well, Governor Rockefeller, you gave all this money to all these different people. Why are you doing that? He said, I'm really rich. And he said, so somebody writes to me and says their child needs an operation. He goes, how can I say no? A student writes to me and said they can't afford to go to college. How can I say no? I thought it was the best answer in the world, which was true. It wasn't made up. So anyway, so he's confirmed. It was the first time, though, that a president and the vice president were serving that had not been elected. Neither one of them had actually been elected to their office. Yeah, isn't that amazing? So in Section 2 of the 25th Amendment, it says, this question was answered. Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority of both houses of Congress. So they just set it into law, okay, so there wouldn't be confusion. Of course, impeachment. And we all have heard too much about impeachment. Or I don't know if too much, but we don't need any more. Hopefully it won't be need for one. So the House of Representatives votes a bill of impeachment by a simple majority. That is the indictment. Okay, those are the charges. An impeachment doesn't automatically remove a president, as we know. The Senate holds the trial with the senators as the jury, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides, and 2/3 of the Senate must vote to convict to remove a sitting president from office. Okay, the impeachment. The problems of succession. So, discussion. And we can do questions, we can do comments to help facilitate it. I hope you'll think about this question. How powerful is the president? Does the office have too much or too little power to effectively lead the nation in the 21st century?
Well, where does Truman fit in all this?
Truman, when I was going through on presidents, okay, I hated to leave him out, but you only have so much time. He was, of course, widely unpopular as president, though he does get reelected, right, to office. Looking back at him, a lot of people say Truman was a pretty good president, right? Look who he followed, FDR. Who was a phenomenal president and very effective, and whether you liked him or not, he was certainly effective. So Truman comes in with very little political experience. He was a senator, but he'd been a county judge before that. He hadn't gone to college. I mean, FDR shared nothing with him, including the existence of the atomic bomb. And he comes into power and then has to, deal with the Congress and the people and then the Soviet Union. So I don't know. What do you think?
I think he ranks very well.
Okay, ranks very well. And I think I didn't look to see his ranking, and of course those can be all over the place. I think, though, he's come way up over the, past several years. Yes, Dan?
I have a question. You mentioned Jackson and the fact that he ignored some of the Supreme Court proclamations or whatever. Aside from impeachment, what power is there within the country to sort of require that the president conform to these particular laws or whatever?
That's a phenomenal question. Okay, what power does the Supreme Court have? Let's go at it from that point of view, because they can't impeach the president. Is the power for them of their prestige. Okay? That's why it's important for the Supreme Court not to go too far outside of the political norms, if you're thinking, left or right, of what the public will accept. I had a former student who was worked as in the Supreme Court, And she talked about that with one of the justices, and that's exactly what she was told. How did the court rule today? Does anybody know? The Affordable Care Act?
They thought it okay.
They thought, what they said was they didn't have standing, okay? In other words, they wouldn't, but they could have said, oh no, we have standing and thrown it out, but they didn't want to get themselves in, lose the prestige of the court. They don't have a military, they don't have any of that stuff. So impeachment is the only way to go. And I used to, as an exercise for my students, I would hold a trial, an impeachment trial of Andrew Jackson, even though he was not impeached. But for high school students, it was a great one because there was all sorts of things that he did that were pretty out there. Plus, they had to include constitutional arguments, and there were some clear constitutional arguments. Did that answer your question?
Not quite. It just seems like the Supreme Court can pass the buck. I think one of these cases coming up, for instance, relative to Roe versus Wade, for instance, and I think it's Mississippi wants to make the 15 weeks as opposed to the current, except the 24 weeks for requiring viability of the fetus, etc. And there's a great fear that, Paul was listening to me because of the stuff we heard the other day, a very good scholar, but the question is, it's such a hand grenade if they could throw in an election time, so whether would they support it or not, depending on
Yeah. I just read in this past year during the pandemic, Jeffrey Toobin, who's now, of course, in sort of trouble. We won't talk about that. But what was it called? The Nine, I think. It was the book I read. And it goes into, it doesn't talk about the current Supreme Court. Few of the members are still on it, but it was just the previous court, Rehnquist court, basically. And talks about the politics that are involved in it and how they look at that and how they decide and everything. And he does a really good job of sort of talking about how they handle that. But no, you bring up a very good point. Did you want to comment, ma'am?
Actually, he did, more or less on the powers of the president, but I don't know if there was a good weekly series, I think it was last week in the Globe. The editorial board had put together a lot of sort of questions and thoughts about Trump's presidency, and they said most presidents up until the time of Trump had sort of stayed within boundaries of not necessarily the law, because there weren't certain laws for things he did, but they just did, and Trump stepped outside of those, as they more or less pointed out, in many areas that maybe we should look at and change and make laws to control the power of the presidency.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I unfortunately didn't read all of that. I read some excerpts. I need to go back and read it. Ma'am?
Two things. Rachel Maddow on her show I watched occasionally, and she brought to light saying what an excellent series it was and so forth, and this was halfway through. I think it was on Wednesday, and it ran the whole week. I printed those things out to read, bedtime reading at night.
Yeah, I've saved them to go back and look at because it was interesting. Yeah.
And
the other did a good job with it.
And the second thing is, I did look up Mornings on Horseback, which I read a long time ago, and that was Dave McCullough who wrote that. One of the smaller books.
Yeah.
But it's excellent.
It is.
Yeah.
Thank you. So it's David McCullough. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. John?
Just an observation, I think Andrew Jackson and President Trump are one and the same.
Well, did you hear what John just said? He said Andrew Jackson and President Trump are one and the same. Whose picture did Donald Trump have hanging in the Oval Office? Andrew Jackson. So Jackson wasn't. Okay. All right. So, some of these are great comments. Somebody else, what's the thoughts on? Any other comments? Mrs. Keneally? You always have the best comments.
I think it's a draw. I mean, I don't think that they have too much power, and I don't think that they need more power. I think it's status quo right now.
Okay, so status quo, not too much, not too little power. I suppose it really goes back to things like character and the in today's world how they deal with people. You saw President Biden, this past week on the international stage, and he was at a press conference yesterday, which I thought he handled really well. But it was interesting because the last question was asked by a female reporter. He was walking off stage, and yeah, no problem. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Good to see you. Was walking off stage, and she hollered out a question, and in the question, he said she misquoted him, and he stopped, and he came over, and he kind of exploded a little bit at her and said, "You got to stop."
Yeah, Caitlin Collins.
Oh, was it Caitlin?
Caitlin, was she the one he got mad at her and they apologized to her?
Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't know it was Caitlin Collins, although interesting. Yeah. But yeah, so I was going to say, so he kind of went off and said, "That's not what I said, you've misquoted me. This is what I actually said." Okay, he was very clear. Then later on, when he was going out in the tarmac, I guess, to get on his plane, he went over to the press corps and said, "Listen, I want to apologize. I was a little," I don't know if he said dismissive but he criticized himself for the way he handled it, which was I think was smart, because it shows, that he has the ability to apologize, which is important. Yes, sir.
As far as the power question is concerned, it seems to me it's somewhat relevant to how the Congress and the representatives and the senators are acting at the time. Currently, they're sort of acting like lapdogs. And effectively, Trump wielded a lot of power. With a different Congress, would have been different, seemed different.
I don't know if everybody heard that, but what he suggested was that in the current Congress, I think you were referring to Republican senators and congressmen, they're like lapdogs to President Trump, as opposed to really coming out with programs standing up for the constituents, though I guess that's also their concern, of course, but not wielding the power that Congress has. The founding fathers really they put, Article 1 was the legislature for a reason, that they thought that Congress should be the preeminent or the most powerful of the branches of government. And if they don't fall through, we look at wars, right? The last war that was a declared war, there's Annie, she was in it, okay? Fought in World War II, right? World War II. And what's that? Roosevelt, okay? You're a veteran of World War II? Are you a veteran of World War II? I apologize, I miss you too, So important, right? So important. But since then, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, they weren't declared wars. Congress said, okay, you may use the troops, okay, and here's the funding, and they're afraid, individual members of Congress will come up and say, we got to stop funding these wars or whatever, but they're afraid of being called anti-American, or you're not, you're going to take money away, your guns out of the hands of our troops, they'll all be killed, all these crazy claims. Again, I always talk about Andrew Bacevich, who is a wonderful retired Army colonel whose son actually was killed in Iraq. I believe it was Iraq, if not Afghanistan. I think it was Iraq. And a retired Boston University professor of history and political science, Massachusetts resident. And he talks a lot about the ongoing emergencies that require a strong military presence. And that presidents, he says it doesn't matter if they're Republicans or Democrats, the presidents are under control of their advisors, of the military, of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, all pushing to always have emergencies going on. And then he makes the further point of, after Vietnam, they did away with the draft, right? So when we were young people, we were really concerned about the draft, and our families were. And if you got drafted and went to Vietnam, that was a big deal. And students were protesting and everything. You don't see any of that anymore because it's a volunteer military. And we have a wonderful military. The people who volunteer are really great people, but most Americans aren't impacted. It's not a personal thing. It's not our kids that are being drafted, so we're not as involved. And Andrew Basovich points that out. Yes, ma'am?
Well, when I was 24, my free trip to Europe was on the U.S. Army because I taught school for the DOD in Germany on one of those army posts. And Donald Rumsfeld closed a lot of those. I mean, there's still Wiesbaden and Ramstein, those places. So it was a small, what the Army called ASA post, Army Security Agency, which I think has been incorporated. So I started out with 48 kids in a Quonset hut teaching first grade. About 1/8 of them spoke only German because their fathers were enlisted men, and then the German wives went back to live with their mothers in Germany during that time, and then the kids came to the American school, right, Council American School. I started with 48. I ended up with 38 after the principal took my 10 best students away and gave them to the second grade. And at the end of the year, of those 38, only 12 were the original group because the men had all been rotated out to Fort Lewis, Washington, and then to Vietnam. And that was, really something. I came from Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where I had like 18 kids in the first grade, so it was quite an experience. But, and I remember the guys who were officers then, and the officers come, "Oh, the Army really ruined me. I should be in graduate school now. Or I'm an architect and I should be practicing." It's like, the poor dears, 3 years. And they're poor, especially there were a couple guys from Yale there. This really ruined me. I should be working Wall Street now, So it was, and my father was too old for World War II, so it was a new experience for me about the TDY and DOD and all this stuff, so.
Yeah, and those were the officers, so you think about the enlisted men that are, being led by these guys, and it was bad. Yes, sir?
Curiosity. If the president declares an emergency and he wants to send troops somewhere in the world, is there any way Congress can stop him from doing that?
Not for the first, I think it's 60 days. He can basically use the troops as he wants to. And then it was passed in 1973, and I should have reviewed this. It's the Dan, do you remember what it's called? It's it was a result of Vietnam and the ongoing Vietnam conflict. So Congress tried to. So after 60 days, he has to go to Congress, and they have to give him permission to continue to use the troops. I apologize. I've been retired for 6 years, and it's just like some things, if I don't review them, they're just not there. But yes, they can, but they typically don't, right? Because they're saying, oh, it's an emergency, and we can't pull out the support of our troops.
But yeah, I was just wondering if they could.
They could, yeah, and they can actually pass a law, saying you can't do it. You can't do it at all. President George H.W. Bush, if you remember, went to Congress for permission to go into Iraq in the Persian Gulf War, and that was, a lot of people criticized him and said, you shouldn't be doing that. And he actually said, no, we need to do that. I remember it because I was an advisor to the debate club at my school, and we were at a college at a model Congress when that debate was going on, and it was, you can imagine these bright, juniors and senior high school kids, hundreds of them coming together while that debate's going on in Washington. They were debating the issue, and
Well, wouldn't that say that perhaps Congress has the absolute power?
Oh,
And I think the absolute is the wrong word, a little
Yeah.
strong. But ultimately, they're the most powerful branch of government.
but they have to, as this gentleman was suggesting, they don't use it because they can't get along, or the leadership in the House or the Senate isn't strong enough to, it's such a divided, but they do have the power of the purse strings, which is huge, okay? And only ones that can declare war. But of course, the president's been fighting wars for, 80 years without declaring. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, just one last thing. Has there ever been anyone like Mitch McConnell who says he's going to pass, like when he said he was passing nothing that, Barack Obama, and then he just said the same thing? I mean, I was so annoyed. I typed a letter to Elizabeth Warren, and I said, they have to, Democrats have to start calling more attention to that, but he refuses to. Has there ever been a member of Congress who refused to pass anything that the opposing party suggested?
Yeah, the radical Republicans after the Civil War they were even refusing to admit Democratic duly elected members of Congress into the Congress. As the Southern Confederate States, there was a whole series of steps they had to go through to become a state again and be able to send people to Congress. And so the radical Republicans, the names aren't coming up. There's been some pretty powerful, but in modern times, can anybody think of anybody that's really had the power to stop everything like Mitch McConnell? I mean, he did that to Obama. And
I saw on the Globe the other day that NYET, they're calling him a Niet, especially with Putin, the Niet senator now.
yeah, Niet is no in Russian, of course. And so what it does is, what did Obama do? He just started putting out executive orders, which basically strengthened the presidency over Congress even further. And then again, it's up to Congress to try to stop them. Right, so it's, yes, sir. Oh, I thought somebody said something. I apologize. Oh, okay. Any other questions or comments? This has been terrific. We have one more in July, which is the judiciary on this four-part institutions of government. And that'll be in July. I don't remember the date. It's right before we go away. I think it's it's a Thursday, anyways, at 1 o'clock. I think it's the 15th. Yeah, it's it's always the third Thursday of the month. So
Maybe there'll be cookies too.
We have to get a petition, I guess.
yeah, I know it. We talked about it also. I said, well, I could drive around to people's houses and give out cookies.
Do they have to be individually wrapped?
Well, we offered that. We offered that.
I said I'd individually wrap.
Yeah, I mean, we would have gone and bought cookies, individually wrapped, but they said no. They said no.
They said no food in any way.
Yeah.
We can have coffee and conversation without coffee. Not allowed yet.
Yeah.
Of course, we could be like teenagers, right? And just yeah, smuggle them in. I hope the camera's still not running here. Oh, it is? But anyway, only kidding. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I hope to see you again next month. If you're away on vacation, enjoy it. And they are taping it, so it would be available on YouTube.